The Colab notebook is a great tool, very interesting environment with a lot of advantages and pros, but it also has its disadvantages and cons. It would be very interesting if we could profit from the Google Colab environment, especially the use of its GPUs and pre-installed libraries. But instead of using the Colab notebook, we could use different IDEs, for example, the Jupyter Lab or the classic Jupyter notebooks. The Jupyter Lab is a web-based interactive development environment for Jupyter notebooks, for code and for data. And it allows more powerful things than the classic Jupyter notebook, but it also has some limitations. So sometimes it would be interesting if we could use Jupyter Lab or also the classic Jupyter notebook inside the Colab environment. And this is actually possible. The first thing we are going to do is to install the Jupyter Lab. So it's installed, and it tells us that we must restart the runtime in order to use this installed version. So let's restart the runtime. And now we can try to run Jupyter Lab, but we will get some warnings. So first, saying that running as root is not recommended, and then we should use the allow root to bypass this. Now we see that there is a Jupyter Lab running on the local host and on this port here, and also it is blocking our Jupyter, our Colab notebook, so we cannot do anything until this cell stops to run. The first problem we have is that now this Jupyter Lab is running on the local host of the remote Colab server. And if we try to click on this link here, it will try to access this Jupyter Lab, but from our local host. We are in the client side, so we are connecting to a remote environment, and this would be so our local host, and of course it's not going to find. So in order to solve this problem, we could use, for example, some tunneling, some TCP tunneling, and then we will tunnel this local host from the remote environment to, for example, a public IP, and then from this public IP we could access the Jupyter Lab. Another problem is that, for example, if we want to continue to use this Colab notebook here, we would have to run the Jupyter Lab without blocking the Colab environment, and there are ways how we can do this. In order to solve this problem, accessing the local host on the remote server, on the remote Colab environment, we can make use of Ngrok, and Ngrok will offer tunneling. And if you go here to ngrok.com, you can see on pricing, and you see that there is a free, you can sign up for a free account, and this will give you HTTP and TCP tunnels on random URLs and ports. So what it will do, it will tunnel this local host, so this IP address to, it will create a public URL that you can access. So you can, if you want to follow this tutorial, you can go ahead, sign up for a free account, and then you can sign up with GitHub, or you can sign up with Google, and then you will have your Ngrok account, and inside your Ngrok account you have an authorization token that you can use in different applications. After you create your Ngrok account, you will see here the online tunnels. So if you make one of this tunneling, make use of one of these, it should appear here, and also here at your authorization token, you will get this authorization token that we're going to use later on. So after you made an account Ngrok, we can go and install pyngrok. So now we have an Ngrok account and we have pyngrok, so we can use this Ngrok from our Colab notebook. Our next step will be to start this Jupyter Lab, but we will want to use pyngrok later, so this cannot be a blocking command in our Colab, so we need to make use of different strategy. We're not going to run using this exclamation mark here to access the shell. What we are going to do is we are going to use the get ipython system raw, then we are going to execute Jupyter Lab allow root, no browser because we want it to run in the background. We will set our IP to localhost 0000, but we can also change the port. This is not necessary, it's already localhost by default, but the default port is 8888, but you can choose a different port, and here we will run in the background. So now when I execute the cell, and if for example we do a Jupyter server list, we see that there is a Jupyter server running on the 0.0.0 port 13,000, and this is an authorization token that is created by the Jupyter server. So this is a token for the Jupyter server. There's nothing to do with the token of Ngrok that we're going to run later. So we have our Jupyter Lab running in the background, and now we can use pyngrok to make the tunneling from this IP to a public IP that we can access over the internet. So what we can do now is that from pyngrok we will import ngrok. We will just terminate any open tunnels if it exists, as it's not necessary at this point because we didn't use pyngrok before, but this is a good common practice. Here you're going to enter your authorization token that it's available from this link here. So if you go here to your Ngrok account, and you'll see your authorization token, and it's very important that you don't share this authorization token with anyone, otherwise people can start using your account. And you can change this authorization token if you feel that it's time to change. So you would enter your authorization token here, and now we will configure Ngrok to use your authorization token. And then we can, after this step, we can do Ngrok connect, and we will use the same port as we used here, which is the 13,000. So I'm going to use the 13,000. And also you can add different tunneling types, and you can enter different IP, and you can use, for example, a TCP or an HTTP tunnel. In this case, by default, we are going to use the HTTP. The protocol tunnel defaults to HTTP. This is why we don't need to enter here anything else. So we configure to use our Ngrok authorization token. Now we are configured to use the port, the same one we want our Jupyter Lab to use. And now Ngrok generates this URL that is accessible from the internet. And now we can access here, and it's going to ask authenticate the session. So we could have created a password before, but we can also use this token here. Right here, and we can log in, and it will start a Jupyter Lab session inside our Google Colab environment. So it's loading Jupyter Lab, and now we have Jupyter Lab inside our Colab environment. So in our Colab environment, we also have here the sample data. Here we also have access to files. We have different kernels, so we can have a Python 3 notebook, a Python 2 notebook, R notebook. We can edit text files, markdown, and it exists also some extensions that we can install. So for example, we can install translation extensions, debugger, and other things, LaTeX extensions, Git extensions, and we will do this later. But for now, just reviewing, we needed an Ngrok account, we installed Jupyter Lab, then we start our Jupyter Lab in the background, and then we use Ngrok to tunnel this local host, so this IP address port 13,000 to a public IP address that is accessible from anywhere on the internet. One good thing is that when we install the Jupyter Lab is an IDE for Jupyter Notebooks, so we also have the classic Jupyter Notebooks. So if we copy this and we replace lab by 3, we will enter this page here where we can, for example, start a Python 3 classic notebook. So now we have our Python 3 classic notebook, and we also have Jupyter Lab with all the features of Jupyter Lab. So, okay, I want to close this notebooks. Also close this, close our Jupyter Lab, shut down. Now we can check there are some servers still running. So there are no servers running. We can also kill our Ngrok, and then it's closing this tunneling. So we can use the Google Colab notebook, and we can also use a Jupyter classic Jupyter notebooks, and we can use Jupyter Lab. But good thing is that we can change the runtime, for example, to a GPU. Okay, let's factory reset the runtime, start everything over again. Here are the outputs. So we have here some, now it's factory reset, so we will install Jupyter Lab again. We need to restart the runtime once again. We will install pyngrok. This time we will set up a password with Jupyter Lab password. So now we can enter here a password. You can type in, you verify. It wrote the password. We can see that inside our Colab environment we have access to the GPU. So it's a Tesla 37C. So let's start our Jupyter Lab. So now we have this Jupyter Lab running here. This address, we don't have an authorization token here because we want to access using the password that we just set. So here you again can plug in your authorization token here and run to set this authorization token, and we can connect. So now we just need to put our password here, and we will log in. We can start a Python 3. You see that we have our GPU also from inside Jupyter Lab. So it's now very convenient. We have all the power of Google Colab, we have the power of Jupyter Lab, we have the power of a Jupyter classic notebooks. We just replace here by 3. We can also have here a terminal. So we see we are in the content, which is the same sample data is here. So for example, we can write a file test text test. So we have this test here. We also have this test here. So we have our Colab environment running Colab notebooks, running Jupyter Lab, running classic Jupyter notebook, and running a terminal. There is even a more simple way of doing this, which is using this Colabcode. It's a library. So there is this Python package called Colabcode. You can install Colabcode, install, and it will take care of this part of tunneling for us. So here you still need an Ngrok account, and here you would place your authorization token. Also needs to restart the runtime. Here you would enter your authorization token from your Ngrok account. Now we will import Colabcode. Here you can also choose the port, and you can enter your authorization code. Lab equals to true will start Jupyter Lab, and you can already access the Jupyter Lab. Here we need our Jupyter Lab token. And voila, we have our Jupyter Lab, and we can also have our classic Jupyter notebook when we use the 3 instead of here. So we just use this import Colabcode, and all this process of tunneling is taken care. But I thought it would be interesting to show how to use Ngrok, because you can use in many different applications when we need. For example, you can create a web server using some JavaScript or Python, or and then you can tunnel from Google Colab or from Binder to a public, or even your local computer to a public URL that can be accessible by other people. So that's it for today. Until our next tutorial.